Testing, testing. One, two, three. Hello. We're there. Can folks hear me? All right. I'm gonna have to relocate this and move this over. Slowly getting folks in here as we speak. Hello. Let's give a moment here to allow folks to jump on in. Give me a give me a live chat feed here. Where are we at? There we go. Yes. Hello. Welcome. Thank you all for being here. I know we're gonna have some transition pains from one stream to the next. YouTube is honestly not really great when it comes to setting up streaming and scheduling things ahead of time. You copy the keys, you put things in, and they just never really work out with what's promised. But let me go ahead and share my screen here for us, so that way we have the PowerPoint screen on screen. Welcome everyone. My name is Brandy J. Lewis. I am a fifth year PhD candidate at the University of California, Riverside in Southern California. I specialize in science fiction, film and media studies, queer theory, and print studies, particularly around archival documents and working with anything that is considered rare. I have been a furry since 2005, just about, with my first convention being Califur in Southern California. And I honestly have used that as a way to get into academia and to kind of sit with what is so interesting about the things that we do as fans and as furries, and what does it allow us to take on, whether through artwork, comics, literature, poetry, all that sorts of stuff. And today we're going to be talking a little bit more about that area, rather than focusing on the online world, on VR chat, on digital characters and personas. I like to sit with the print and paginated works that fans have created, going all the way back to Voodie, and Raubrazel, and using those as a starting point to where the fandom inevitably got its going. And so by the end of today's talk, we should have a pretty good focus on what the page means for furries, but also kind of like, what does it mean to do this stuff in an archive? What is it like to hold on to these older things that for us mean so much, and yet for academics might be rather eclectic and strange? All right. So the plan for today is we're going to do just a brief introduction. We just did it. And then discussing the archives at UC Riverside. So at UC Riverside, we do host a large collection of science fiction, fantasy, manga, comics, and fan media within one of our archives. And so I do want to go into that before focusing on the work that I did and what I got to handle, including fanzines, comics, pornography, all that sorts of stuff, and why it's interesting to me as both a furry fan and a scholar. By the end of this, I should be able to offer space for questions, and so you all should get a chance to ask me anything that maybe stokes your curiosity. All I ask is that if you do have a question, please write it down and save it for questions and answers eventually, because the nature of the stream is that it's tough running this by myself and changing back and forth between YouTube and the PowerPoint and streamed screen. And so hold on to questions if you can until the end, and then we'll kind of go from whatever you provide for me at that point. All right. So first off, I want you to think about what is an archive in your mind. What comes to you when you start thinking about a space where rare books, ephemera, um, old texts are held, and what does it mean to have furry documents in that space? Now, a document can be anything from a flyer, a printout. It could be a fanzine or amateur press association document. Document. Anything that could be exchanged and provide some sense, if not wealth, of information. For furries, we've had a long history in which we've printed, written on, and toyed with documents, whether those be comics or otherwise. And so to think that this material is collected and held onto, not just by Riverside, but other universities, kind of draws out something that I think is fun and malleable to work with. Now, during the summer, and kind of the focus of this talk, I was able to take an internship opportunity with special collections and university archives at UC Riverside. I primarily worked within the Eaton collection, which is one of the world's largest collections of science fiction, fantasy documents and materials, inclusive of manga, anime, books, original science fiction pulp magazines. I got to hold some of the original Amazing Story magazines from back in the early 20th century. That was a lot of fun. But probably most potent for me was getting to hold furry documents from Rao Brazel, and then recently we just got in a big shipment of Voodie, running from issues 1 to 37, with some issues missing, of course. We can't have everything on campus for a various amount of reasons. And for the internship, essentially, my goal was to first go in and figure out how is it, because these materials were donated to the university by historian Fred Patton, Patton being a furry fan himself, as well as editor for many anthologies. Following Patton's stroke in 2005, he and a bunch of his friends and fans began the process of relocating his documents and collection to the archives. And so I first entered this space considering, how do we understand as scholars what's here, and what is a good way to work with the materials? Um, just right off the bat, a lot of the archivists there did not know what furry was, and the undergraduates who were there for work study, they run the front desk, they run reproductions, anything that happens be behind the library desk they work with. A lot of them didn't even know what it meant to be a furry. And so I would frequently get told, like, the undergrad students took a look at this stuff and were like, what is that? And for me, I kind of had a smile, like, I know what that stuff is. I could only imagine what they're looking at. But I wanted to sit with, what is the value of holding these materials in an institutional space? And what is the messiness that furry is? And how do you collect something that is seemingly over the top, always a mixture of many documents? I'm going to try and check the chat here for a moment. All right. And then what does it mean to, like, put this out there for other scholars who might not be furry fans to sit and work with? And so first off, though, however, the archives are open to the public. And so at any point you do feel interested in looking at these materials, Voodie, Rowbrezel, original Furry Party flyers, you can make an appointment to go and read the documents in the reading room, and the photo here on screen is shows the reading room itself. You're not able to take these documents home, of course, because of their rare and valuable nature. However, you would register at aon.library.ucr.edu as and more so an independent researcher, unless you do attend University of California Riverside campus. And you are able, if not to access these documents in person, you can order reproductions online. There is a fee per page, and it's depending on whether it's a PDF or another form of document file type. But these opportunities are there for you if you would like to use them. And the folks at Special Collections would really love to see the space utilized, as well as attention being drawn to the archive itself. And so oftentimes there are special exhibits there as well. At the time of building this PowerPoint, we had one called Direct to the People that looked at pamphlets and their use across different political movements. But right now, there's actually an exhibit on aliens with science fiction and first encounters of various sorts. And so we do have a first edition copy, I believe, of Octavia Butler's Dawn and other works that fans might be able or interested in looking at. And so to redirect back to the internship itself, the internship was a 6-month long position with Special Collections. I was under the title of what was known as student assistant, whatever number. And from the end of spring until the start of fall quarter, I essentially had access to the rare book collection that's there. So I could use the reading room, I can pull out boxes when I needed them, but I also could go back to the stacks or the aisles where all these documents are kept. Now, the archive is a closed stack library, and what that means is that only certain individuals with access power could get back there. And so it's very special and very exceedingly rare to get to go back there as a scholar and pick through the stacks, pull something out and look at it, hold it, see what it feels like. And I loved every moment of it. Being able to hold an issue of Amazing Stories and then move a few steps to the right and find the first publication of Dune was exciting. And it also gave this like real theoretical messiness of seeing like how comic fandom and manga anime fandom bled into furry, or how furry bled into comics. These materials are of course separated by certain aisles of documents, books, what have you. And yet by being in the same space, there is this excitement in knowing that several aisles over, Patton's collection is in conversation with the comics of the 1980s and 90s, certain aisles back. And so I got to go in, look at whatever I wanted. I had access to reproductions, of course, and recording technology. And so I got a chance to like pull out an issue of Raul Brazel, walk through it, record a review of the document for other scholars to think about. And for, again, my goals for this internship were to think about what is Furry's place within the archive and the UC system. How is it that Patton, as this historical figure for Furry, in some ways creating a way to understand Furry? Or maybe perhaps not. Is there a way that Patton himself maybe struggled with how to collect this material? From what scholars have written about, the materials themselves were collected and brought to the institution by fans. And so this was very much a communal process and not just tied with Patton's work and his place as a scholar. And so for me, it was like, how do I sit with this? How do I think through the many layers of who touched these documents, where they came from, and where they might go in terms of future scholarship? But I also get a chance to work with the archivist there and think about what other materials might we not know about that exists within Patton's collection. And so he had some handwritten letters from original science fiction editors back when the time of Hugo Gernsback. But he also had exchanges with Dr. Tezuma or Tezuka of Astro Boy fame. And so not only was I focused on Furry, but I was also getting a chance to sit with like who was Patton as a figure and how did his many relationships, connections, and interests kind of shape his working with Furry, if not the other way around. Now, one of the great parts about this internship was, of course, as a student, I got valuable experience of learning how to work with these documents, how to handle them, how to teach around or about them, as well getting a feel of what the job market is like working with these materials. So maybe teaching is not for me. I thought, what about working as an archivist, as a librarian, as a teaching librarian? What might that be like? And how can Furry be a way for us to engage with the archive as a particular space of institutionality? So a typical day for me during this internship was I would arrive to special collections. I commute to campus. And so I would show up as early as I could. Some days that was harder than others. I would check in at the front desk and lock up all my materials. Now, what that means is I can only have a notebook and a pencil, my laptop. I have also a tablet that I write notes with. And so I wouldn't be allowed to have pens in there because of the ink possibly damaging the documents themselves. Food and drink are not allowed. You would have to keep that outside of special collections. And so I had to make sure that I was ready to work with these documents. And so kind of the performance of it taught me that I was in an institutional space. But once I work with the front desk, oftentimes helmed by an undergrad student, I would get the documents and sit in the reading room. And so I would use the foam kind of nooks to help cradle the text, whether it's something flat and printed or something that was bound and needed to be resting. The little strings that you see in this photo kind of holding the page open for me. And so once I have the document themselves, I would just do a lot of reading. I would just flip pages, take notes. I have actually a 40-page single-space document I wrote up, kind of like a journal, going through everything from Patton's personal contact with various editors, figures of science fiction, fantasy, fan, ephemera stuff. But then also I would take photos. I would get a lot of chances to take photos, as you see here with an issue of Critters edited by Kim Thompson. Um, and every day was a new experience. Every day I would find anything from hand-drawn comics, included animation cells of furry characters that animators were working on while being furry fans themselves, or funny animal comic fans as they were known by. Correspondences, of course. But also, I would find a lot of adult materials or things that were private and personal to, say, Patton or other figures. And so, for me, it was this kind of dimensional practice, going in and not looking for a fixed understanding of this text or document, but always being open to challenging and changing my perspective, uh, giving into the process, knowing that I might find something I never expected. Some weeks I would look at Tijuana Bibles. Other weeks I would look at underground comics such as Funny Aminals with Crumb and Art Spiegelman. And then, of course, looking at Amazing Stories and kind of feeling out what it's like to do this work. But again, like, what does it mean to collect these documents as an institution and hold a certain privilege value to them? So as I'm sitting with the documents, I would very often think, how much of this material actually exists. And so we're constantly getting new additions to the collection, to the archive, whether that be through um, relationships to Fred Patton or otherwise. So recently we just got a collection, like I mentioned, of Voodie. And for me, I always have to ask how much of this exists. How many issues of Voodie did we get? And is it like a flush of documents? Is it from one, two, three, four, five? Or is it like issues one to two, four to five, six, seven, nine, 10? And every day again, it was a challenge to try to like do that work that I needed to do and connect meaning between one issue and the next. Um, and once I had that down, it was like, okay, what here is valuable or important to the work that I'm doing? And so my dissertation currently is looking with the printed history of furry. So again, rather than looking at simply fan practices, fursuiting, fursonas, I'm sticking with the pages of the fanzines, of pornography, of comics, and trying to think what happens if we see the page as this expansive queer space where fans could take on whatever they wanted to and imagine different potentials, whether in our real world or otherwise. And so it was a lot of thinking, okay, what are the terms that our fans using within these documents? How are they changing, adapting, growing? What kind of conversations were being held? How was patent attached to these, if at all? But also, what are the things we don't have, and what does that say? And so there was an issue 4 of Raoul Brezel that we don't have, but in issue 4 of Raoul Brezel, there would be adult content that was so adult that fans in issue 5, 6, and into the 90s would question what kind of adult material would we allow in furry. To what extent do we need to censor ourselves, our community, or just let people do their thing? And we don't have that issue 4, and so I don't know what was in it. I can only assume that it was potent enough that we still see effects of that today, where it's like we're still questioning on Twitter what is too sexual, what is too adult natured for the fandom, what is too queer and messy to sit with. But also that playfully draws out a conversation scholars are having right now on like, what does it mean that the institution can't get a hold of this material in many ways? Not only is it something that we don't have, but maybe it's something that institutionality cannot reckon with or sit with. What does it mean to make porno of the cartoon animal character? Well, that exceeds academia's knowledge or ways of discussing this, one would argue. And so my research questions would very much work as you see, one and off or off one another. I would come in with one question or problem and have to change direction at a moment's notice. But thankfully, the people at Special Collections were very helpful, very supportive of the work that I was doing. And they were really excited to see what was coming out of documents that they never really got to handle or work with. The collection is, or Patton's collection is unprocessed, which means that while we do have an understanding of what exists within these boxes, there's no finding aid that really goes into the detail of how much of what's in there exists or what exactly is in box 54 in folder 3. Those things kind of exceed the ability that we're able to use or have right now. But that's where we as scholars and fans and critics can enter and see kind of what's there and what's useful to us, but also what destabilizes us. In what way does furry constantly like to go up against orders of knowledge or control? We're funny queer little animals just trying to do our thing, and I think it's great that the institution to a certain extent can't bring a way of thinking through what we do. So as I'm going through this material, I learned a lot myself. One thing being that furry was very much in conversation and happening inside of, around, and out of comic fandom. So in the early comic conventions, science fiction conventions of the 70s and 80s, and then of course the 90s, you did have recognition by outside of early furry of fans doing their thing. And so you have issues of Row Brazzle discussing how like Worldcon was like, hey, do you want to speak at our convention on funny animal comics? Hey, do you want to throw a furry party? Here's some rooms to do that in. And I think it was great to see that the fandom was not this kind of always already um, monstrous vehicle for some, but was rather this included part of comics fandom to certain extents. But also, doing the work that they did, fans would use the page as this way of figuring things out. Excuse me. Um, the page was very much this radical space of using the cartoon animal aesthetic that furry scholars like Cameron Dunn write about, and creating their own narratives, their own worlds, their own representations of them going to conventions, as you see here on the right. And for me, as a scholar interested in what kind of stories were told through the page, um, aligning furry with the independent comics movement and the underground comics movements uh, was just fascinating. And I know that when I finish my dissertation, whenever that may be, I'm going to be very interested to see how future furries, and or current furries rather, and future scholars take up the work, if at all. Um, Now, in terms of like adult content, I found that just like we do today, furries back when, funny animal fans would contest the extent to which adult content would exist within their spaces. So you have figures like Ken Cougar Sample arguing we shouldn't censor our fandom. We should really let people do what feels important work for them, and let editors decide what is too much based upon editorial control, whether it's offensive, whether it's violent. But then you had others who were very much in the radical space of, we're kind of resisting the establishment. We get to get away with this stuff, so why not just do what we want to do? And again, this would follow into the 90s and, of course, into today, where you do see a lot of controversy on what does it mean to sexualize the maw of a character or paws? What does it mean to use like four-legged though anthropomorphic characters within sexual aligning work? And so for me, having grown up with the fandom from my early teens in the early or the mid 2000s into my early 30s, it's inspiring to see like, okay, this is something that we will possibly always sit with and think through. But that leaves room for us to think about the political potentials of this work. Pornography, if you look at scholars like Lynn Hunt, who describes the history of porn, um, she argues particularly that porn has already always been political, starting from the resistance held within the time of the French Revolution, and moving into today, where now it's like porn gives ways for queer folks to find value in themselves, their lives, and to think through what is healthy consent, what is healthy sex practices, what does it mean to give affective relationships to one another during times of violence. Furry is not outside of or distinct from that history. In relationship, actually, we are very much in tandem with that stuff. And so whenever I would get adult material, or when the archivist would say, hey, we got a collection of this artwork that's furry like, but it's very pornographic, do you want to see it? I would be like, yeah, of course, because that work is very important to our community, no matter what critics say. Humorously enough, though, I would always be in that uncomfortable position of like going to the front desk, asking the undergrad student, hey, can I actually take this out? And then like having to watch them bring out this very pornographic work and then me take it back to them like, I'm done, let's reshelve this. It was always funny, and it created this kind of levity that, like, yes, this work is eclectic, but that's the value in it, and that through campiness, through hypersexuality, do furries think through what does it mean to have a healthy sex life and to accept sex as part of our community and literature. So describing the internship, describing some of the things that I got to go through on a daily basis, I want to open up to questions, which I think is really going to lead us out into the hour, if not maybe perhaps beyond that. I do have time into 12:30 if we want to go, but really this is a chance for you to ask questions, discuss with me kind of the things that I engaged with and what they meant to me, but also to take a look at some of the shots that I had and kind of sit with and think through them. So I'm gonna go to the YouTube chat here and just take a peek. Does anyone have any questions, perhaps, for me on what it meant to do this work, but also like what was it like handling issues of Voodoo or Rao Bresl? One thing I will say and add to the conversation is that the work itself demands questions, demands kind of confronting what's there on the page. As scholar Bonnie Mack argues and theorizes, the page is always this shifting space where we take our codes, terms, ideas from society and culture and orient them in a particular direction. And so every confrontation with this material is something new, I would argue, something even disorienting that we as fans have to like, yep, that's there. That's a great question. So Cameron Alfred or Alred asked, "Did you ever feel nervous you tear, damage something or irreplaceable?" Yes, very often. And so I actually started beginning my work as a furry kind of researcher or scholar in during undergrad. I've been on campus at UCR since 2015, and before I graduated in 2017, I got to work with the documents that Patton had in his collection. And looking with that stuff, I would ask them, like, hey, at what point do I need to bring gloves in? At what point do I need to handle this a certain way? And they would frequently, of course, tell me, like, you only need gloves if you're handling photographs or things that could take like fingerprint smudges. In terms of paper, you do see some documents that are very old, very frayed, and it's just you gotta be very careful with them. There are ways to repair and to like take care of the documents if they do get damaged. However, it's very easy work once you get into the swing of it. You do have to, of course, follow certain protocols, keeping anything on the foam pads that they have, but having like a tablet stylus or like a pencil to write notes with separately away from the document was very easy, or very helpful and useful for me to like make sure the documents themselves weren't damaged. Any other questions? Something that I will say, I've written about and I currently have being reviewed by a academic journal, is the discussion on what it means to hold these documents and like find value in them, not just from the fan perspective, but from the scholar perspective. And I would frequently have conversations with my colleagues and the archivists on how furry fans have already always, like comic fans and science fiction fans in general, creating their own archives, their own libraries and collections that take note of the value that this work has to their particular communities. And so this work that I was engaging in is not new and it has a lot of history to it. However, I would say that and this of course could be debated. There is this conversation that could be had on whether or not furry documents are safer in academic spaces such as this, due to climate control, due to handling practices, due to things like provenance, or essentially what is the original organization order of these documents that gives us a hint or understanding of the collector's history and work with them. These things are not necessarily as easily held, I would argue, by fan collectors, simply because life happens. We don't have the finances to always have climate control on these documents. But I will say, along with that, furry materials, as I described, arguably and oftentimes resist the archive and the practices that scholars enter with. Again, the page is always this new speculative space for us. And so to open up art by Terry Smith and sit with a scantily clad ringtail character, that in itself will shift scholars' perspective and require them to engage with maybe that they are not a fan who understands this work, or if they are a fan, how to see it in new ways. That is a great question by Clouded Chimera. Have you found any other academic colleges in the furry archival space, or do you feel like you are spearheading it? I don't know what's going on around UC Riverside. Again, I'm not the first person to do this work, and um, particularly for furry, there are scholars like Cameron Dunn, Yerf, um, escaping my mind right now. Vela, or Vea, they're all doing this work, looking at furry from and Sybil, of course, doing this work looking at furry from a critical lens. Now, in terms of archives, similarly, there are furry fans who are using archives as a way of finding value for themselves, but also showing other fans that this work is important. In terms of colleges, however, um, there was one moment in my internship where I wanted to use early issues of Raubrezel. I think this was early on into the internship, and the librarian who was helping me get these documents said, "Hey, by the way, how long do you need to use this stuff? Because we have a request for Raubrezel from a university in Montana." And like immediately I was like, who is this furry taking my stuff away from me? What is this university doing with Raubrezel? Is somebody doing a dissertation? Because grad work is very competitive to a certain extent. You are trying to do your work as soon as possible so that way your research is out there. And so, because sadly we're tied to neoliberalism and like the job market, and so like you have to be competitive to make a living. But also it was like this weird, like, oh, I'm not the only one doing this work. I don't know what other archives or campuses have this material. And in the article that I'm actually having reviewed, I argue that more campuses should be collecting this work. Um, I try not to get into the mind space that I'm the person spearheading this, because for me, I don't think that's productive, knowing that there's a history preceding me of fans doing this work. But also, I think it would make me more anxious to do this work, um, thinking that I'm spearheading it in some way or fashion. But there are scholars who are doing this work. I know a scholar by the name of Ben Silverman did work on personas. You can actually find their dissertation via Google Scholar, and how for furries, the persona is this way of a queer becoming. We find ourselves through the persona, as well as constantly adapt to the world that we live in. But then also you have scholars like Yerf, who, while more independent, Yerf is thinking about the technologies that fans take up. And I would argue very much the page acts as a technology or a queer form, as Ramsey Fawaz describes it. That's a great question. What surprised me the most while doing my research? It's very hard to surprise me, having been in the fandom since 2004, 2005. Being a fan myself with my own eclectic interest, I've seen uh, pornography, I've seen fiction that ranges from the problematic to the pleasurable and political. But I think what was most surprising to me, again, was seeing how much of comic fandom was open to having funny animal fans as part of their space. I haven't found the words to describe this myself, but funny animal fans did carry with them this kind of radical play of where we are looking back at childish characters, at aesthetics that others might judge us for. If you look at original printings of Voodoo, you do have I think I have one here on the screen. If I go to my next page here on the left, you do have by Ken Fletcher or Reed Waller, um, this understanding that the funny animal character is not a superhero, is not a cyborg or space alien, and in that sense gets forgotten and gets treated as though it's kind of like this thing we need to grow up from. And yet, finding that conventions like Worldcon and otherwise were open to having furry fans and funny animal fans speak at their events and talk about their developing fandom was really exciting to me. Um, More and more today, as we've dealt with a history of pathologization and the media depicting furries in a negative way, like using litter boxes in restrooms. Though it'd be kind of radical to think about, like, would you have like your own personal litter box? Anywho, that's beside the point. Um, Knowing that history that we have and seeing that like there was another way of seeing us prior to that, that was really surprising and exciting for me, and made me realize, Furry was doing something special, and whether or not folks recognize it now outside of the fandom, we do have a long history that has taken part in other arguably wider conversations. And so beyond the pornography, beyond the many uses of the funny animal aesthetic, as Dunn describes it, um, it was seeing kind of furry being in conversation with other spaces and fandoms, and just kind of the productive nature of that work. What other questions might we have? Ah, yes. So I don't recall the issue of Rowbrazzle where it's taken up, but skunk skunk fuckers did appear in the um, the dialogues between fans, particularly within Rowbrazzle and hunting issues of perversion and Q. Now, prior to 1989, when furries got conference, you had again the sitting with what adult material is allowed in the fanzine, what is too much, what is disrespectful, and so you would have fans saying like, as long as it's not objectifying women and sexual and being sexist, we're okay with it. And other fans would be like, I really don't want to see kind of young aesthetic characters being depicted in this way. You out of that kind of conversation and messiness, you do have skunk fuckery coming up, as I described it to one of my colleagues. But fans would even discuss like who did it, and they would bring out names. I don't recall the names of the figures, but of who they thought was doing this work and why. And it resonates in a way with kind of the meme culture where today where people are joshing on furries for being weird and drawing this stuff. And furry fans were, you know, peeved off by it. Like, okay, we're trying to have our party and draw people who like this stuff into our space. Fans were very much interested in like making a space for funny animal fans and early proto furries, as Patton describes it. And to have these flyers go up and make the fandom monstrous and deviant was harmful, of course, as it is today. And so it was really interesting to see kind of the paginated progression of this to where eventually it would get written off as like, okay, those are kind of sticks in the mud people. Like, we're doing our thing and they're just trying to cause trouble for us. Of course, that would haunt us as episodes of CSI, Vanity Fair, and other things came out and kind of ran with that perspective on the fandom. But yeah, you did see that, or you could see that in the issues of Rao Brazel. Verversion was an adult furry fanzine and APA where fans would question the sexual nature of anthropomorphic animals and creatures. And it was very difficult to read that and not be haunted by that conversation of what people were saying about fans outside of the zine space. That's a great question, and it shows how again furry has this history that exists within the archive, and so you can look back and think about how did early fans deal with this issue, and how does that inform or dimensionalize the ways that we operate today. Any other questions? Okay, so have you ever seen anything in the 80s where furries use the word theriomorphic as opposed to anthropomorphic? I've seen it used in one zine from the mid 80s and I thought it was unique. Right, so right around the time of the mid 80s onward, you had fans trying to figure out who and what they were. So if we think about Voodie as this funny animal liberation kind of space and kind of giving reality and emotion to the funny animal character, Rao Brazel would pick that up by Schurmeister in 1984 and kind of take the funny animal as this open space of play and malleability where other genres and directions can be taken up. So you would have eventually centaurs, you would have eventually monsters, dragons, unicorns. And you did have fans question like, okay, are we funny animal fans still? Are we furry fans like we've been called? Interesting enough, it would be Worldcon, Patton remarks in one issue of Rao Brazel, that gives the title furry fandom to the funny animal fans, Rao Brazel members, and the furry parties that were happening. They kind of enmeshed the three. And Patton, hilariously, I would argue, says like, you know, if that works for them, cool. Of course, fans had their own ways of identifying themselves, but you would see many different terms then, like anthropomorphic, theriomorphic, exotics, morphs, just anything fans could use to describe what they were interested in and the work they were doing. I like personally the term furry, which is more contemporary to us, because it gives a sense of the messy nature of those early years, where it was fuzzy, as some scholars would describe it, very messy. Um, but out of that, of course, we would get to where furry then is like this all encompassing space. If you like dragons, if you like anthropomorphic foxes, if you like balloon animals and inflatable pool toys, that can exist within the shared aesthetic space. But you did see that, and I would have to frequently describe to the archivists how that was still attached to furry in ways. Just fans figuring themselves out. But what are fans' interest in these materials and documents? Like, um, as you could see from this slide, we have Voodoo, we have images from Albedo, Anthropomorphics, and Irma Velna. We have furry party flyers, and then we have some more adult natured works. What draws you to this work, and maybe like what questions come out of that? Something that really stood out for me was being transgender. I wanted to think about how much queerness and sexuality existed within these documents. And of course, Voodoo, there would be one comic by Waller where you had this Omaha likening character telling another furry animal, "You are an animal. Take pride in your sexual desires and have fun." Um, that kind of bled into, of course, Raubresel and the question of what to what extent sex existed. But you would find fans very supportive of queerness, of characters like Valky, who acted as this character for us to think with and figure out, created by Robert Hill. And for me, it was a very much positive, healthy experience that no doubt resonates with fans today. And right, going to a comment here by Madison Scott Clary, it was super interesting to see the aesthetic shift and change over time as well. I will resonate with that. Of course, early works were more in the nature of funny animal characters. But as I argue in my dissertation, the independent comics movement, out of the underground comics movement, really allowed for fans to take up numerous directions as long as they could tell the stories that they wanted. And so you have works like Reed Waller and Kate Worley's Omaha the Cat Dancer. But then you also have works like Galachi's Irma Felna and Steve Sakai's Usagi Yojimbo that, okay, moving out of the 80s and into the 90s, you start see things like Sabrina Online, A Domain of Our Own, Associated Student Bodies and Circles, and this kind of support and progression of independence as this structural part of furry. And in that sense, like the messiness of the aesthetics that could be taken up definitely produce the aesthetics that we see now, where you have hyperrealism, pseudo realism, surrealism, cartoon animals, chibi stuff, manga influences. Every day it was exciting to see kind of, yes, the Terry Smiths, but also other artists and what were they doing and what value did they hold to their artistic creativity. Okay. So my work is entirely based in the United States simply because that's what I have available to me. Um, I'm not trying to formalize a fixed understanding of furry nor its history, but I'm really pushing to look at the dimensionality of furry that's allotted by the page, both printed and on screen, that gives us what we know of today as furry. And so if you think about the fanzine space, you have this kind of critical reflection with the funny animal and fantasy character. And then you see the comics of the independent comics movement, and they're taking up of the page as this, well, let's sit with real world issues like divorce, child loss, AIDS, queer community care spaces. And so I'm hoping that this work, rather than focusing on only furry being a USA centered space, rather I think I really want to like generate a framework for us to look outward from the US and think across different borders. I would love to do more European work, and I'm sitting with kind of what that might mean for me. Um, Drafting the dissertation, I have to bring in numerous examples to support my arguments. But at this time, a lot of my work that or a lot of the materials that I'm working with are either U.S. based from the archive, or whatever's published. And so I do look at anthology towards the end of my dissertation, and how fans use anthologies to dimensionalize the fandom and its printed history. How you have editors and writers trying to bring in a diversity of voices to challenge this kind of history of straight cis white homosexuality that we see taking part in works like Circles, Associated Student Bodies, Out of Position, and likewise. In terms of what comes next for my research, just kind of piggybacking, I'm a pig, so piggybacking off that last point. So, in terms of the dissertation, I'm working currently on my second chapter, which is on furry pornography. I argue that furries use the critical syntax that is a part of pornography as a genre to think with and sit with the malleable, sometimes even monstrous bodies that exist within furry. So the werewolf, this creature that transforms after dark into this monstrous hungry figure, gets taken up as a sort of sexual outlaw that can provide care, consent, and relationship qualities to its partner. But then you also get like the more radical, what does it mean to transform into an anthropomorphic pool toy or doll and have to like be in a relationship with someone who's not an inanimate object made animate? I think by looking at that stuff, we really get the sense that furry is trying to find a way of communicating, as Farwah would describe in Queer Forms, the energies and passions and desires that are very difficult to put into terms of English, of language, etc. After this, I'm definitely still sitting with how is furry something that entangles with the archive, particularly when we're thinking about like um, anthologies and furry canonicity. What kind of canon gets constructed, and how do fans kind of challenge that in their own ways, whether through creating their own anthologies or through the online space? I haven't really sat with Twitter and the online sphere yet in my work, but I think if we transfer my reading of the page as this kind of queer becoming itself, as Silverman would describe, then we can then look at how the internet and the page of Twitter or the website becomes another becoming of its own. So we're at the hour now. We can, of course, hold more questions, or we can call it a wrap here. Does anyone have any other questions? These are great questions. Um, I would want to give you a chance to sit with some of the work here, if you need me to go back a couple slides or something. But yeah, this is your time. Something that I would really like to do. I'm not so much. I teach, but probably because of the nature of COVID-19, which is still a pandemic happening to this day, not just in the U.S. but internationally. Um, I would like to help educate fans more on archival practices, at least to the extent that I know them. What it might mean to have access to these documents and get to work with them. And I love when I get to show students, whether furry or not, what these materials are, to us as fans, and kind of what directions do we take from them. And so, if not in academic spaces, I would love to do some publications online for the fandom itself, thinking about like how do we as fans enter the archive and what is that space like? In what way do we kind of disorient the typical understanding of archive by entering and going rogue, as some scholars theorize in terms of fan archives? Any other questions, maybe? Of course. Um, we've had these materials at UC Riverside for some time, and they often again get forgotten because not a lot of people know what furry is besides fans, or outside of fans. And so the materials are open to your access. If you are in the Southern California Riverside area, you would just have to make an appointment or request some documents at aon.library.ucr.edu. I will go ahead and go to that slide just to make sure we have that on screen. And of course, there is a new exhibit at the library at this time on science fiction and alien encounters, so that's there as well to look into. But you can request to work with these documents in the reading room. And if you're willing to pay, you can order reproductions of issues of Voodie, Ralbrazil, Midnight Sonata, Havoc Inc., by Terry Smith and their partner, in creating that comic. So it's there for us just as much as it is for scholars. And I think as fans, we can bring a lot to the archive in terms of our knowledge and experience with the text that we hold on to. Yes, scanning them does take a lot of time. I will say, for Anthrocon, I actually did a panel where I brought in reproductions of Ralbrazil, and not only did it I have to put it a certain amount of time in advance, but I actually had to get assistance of printing the materials and bringing them to the convention. So our beloved Toft, the alpaca, helped me out in that front, and I'm very thankful for that. But reproductions are great because even if you might not be able to access the archive due to location or otherwise, having a reproduction, being able to print out the work and hold it, lends to kind of our understanding of it, I would argue. I was also at Anthrocon. I missed the event. I don't know yet if I can return to Anthrocon this next year. But I'll actually be presenting, I hope, at Anthro New England in this coming January. It seems we're running low in questions. And so, um, I'm going to go ahead and end the stream here. I want to thank you all for being a part of this, allowing me to speak on this work. being a fan, I never thought I would be able to be doing this kind of work. But also being a scholar, I constantly get to talk to other academics on the work that furries are doing, the work that they bring to the table in terms of comic, science fiction, and queer fandom spaces. And every day is something new. People send me things all the time. People ask me about my work, and it's furry has been a really big important part of my life. Just as now, working with these documents has taken up so much of my time. If you have any questions or you really want to get into working with some of these documents, I'll put in the chat my Twitter account. It is Princess of Party on Twitter. Just look for the pig icon. Um, at any point you want to get in contact with me, my email is brandyjlewis@gmail.com. Just send me an email, and I'd love to hear from you on questions, concerns you may have, ideas. As well, keep doing the work you're doing on Twitter. Scholars are paying attention to it. We are recognizing the work that furries are doing, and there are people out there who want to know more about the community. And so, thank you again for having me or letting me have this conversation with you, for being here. And if you'd like to do any of this work, feel free to send me a message, and I can get in contact with you. With that said, stay safe. Have a great weekend. For those of you who are at school, keep working hard. For me, I'm at going on week 4 of week 10. Not sure how we're there, but we're there. And please stay safe. Keep wearing masks if you're doing so. Protect those with autoimmune disorders and disabilities. And keep having fun. Furry is a great place to explore yourself, but also kind of the worlds that we live in. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.